Autumn in Iowa comes and goes in the blink of an eye, with winter sneaking in before the leaves have even settled. Julia Bennett was rinsing breakfast dishes, her gaze lingering on the garden outside the kitchen window where crimson maple leaves whirled restlessly in the breeze, a sight that stirred a vague sense of unease in her chest. "Lila, are you almost ready?" She called up the stairs, her voice soft but steady. "Just a minute, Mom," came the cheerful reply, echoing down from above with the same brightness as always. Julia glanced at the clock and her brow furrowed ever so slightly. Today was a big one. Her team at the pharmaceutical company was unveiling a breakthrough drug they'd spent 5 years developing, and as lead researcher, she was front and center. Still, what weighed heavier on her mind wasn't the high-stakes presentation, but the gnawing anxiety over leaving her 8-year-old daughter Lila in the care of her mother and sister for the entire day. Lila descended the stairs, her small backpack bouncing, her brown hair tied neatly into 2 high ponytails. She was the spitting image of Julia at that age, except for those striking blue eyes, her father David's unmistakable legacy. "Look, Mom. I'm wearing Dad's Christmas gift." Lila beamed, holding up her wrist. A sleek new smartwatch gleamed in the morning light. "I can video chat with Dad on it." Julia gave a warm but measured smile. "That's great, sweetie. Just don't get too distracted with it at Grandma's, okay?" "I won't," Lila promised, though the gleam of curiosity in her eyes suggested otherwise. As they pulled out of the driveway, Julia let out a quiet sigh. It had been 3 years since the divorce. David was now thriving as a branch director overseas, a title that came with money, recognition, and, unfortunately, less time for Lila. No number of FaceTimes or voice messages could truly fill the gap left by a father's absence. "Mom, how did your test go today?" Lila asked, her tone shifting as she glanced down. "Math was kind of hard." Julia reached over and gently rubbed her daughter's shoulder. Lila had her challenges with academics, but her imagination and gentle spirit were more than enough to make Julia proud. "That's all right. We'll work through it together later." "What about your drawing?" Lila's face lit up. "My teacher said she wants to put it in the school art show." "That's fantastic," Julia said, her delight sincere. Art had always been Lila's gift, it came so naturally to her. They soon pulled up in front of her parents' home, a grand white-columned colonial that reflected Margaret Bennett's well-maintained image as one of the town's respected figures. The door swung open as they approached, revealing Margaret with her hair perfectly set and her trademark pearl necklace glinting in the morning light. "Julia, good morning." "Lila, aren't you going to greet your grandmother?" Margaret's voice had that familiar edge, sweet but commanding. Lila quickly offered a polite greeting and stepped inside. In the living room, Julia's sister Nina was leafing through a magazine, coffee in hand. "About time," Nina said with a glance at the wall clock. "I've got a busy day too, you know." Julia ignored the jab and set Lila's backpack down. "I've packed her study materials. She's got some homework, could you help her with it?" "Of course," Margaret replied smoothly, though her eyes lingered on Lila with a hint of judgment. "You know," she added, "Tessa's boy, Nina's friend, he's Lila's age and already doing multiplication." Meanwhile, Lila still wrestling with addition. Julia fought the tightening in her jaw. "Lila moves at her own pace, Mom." "You've gone soft since becoming a mother," Nina chimed in, not bothering to look up from her magazine. "You need to be firmer with her. Spoiling kids only leads to trouble later." As Julia turned to leave, Margaret touched her arm. "Don't worry. Just focus on your work. I'll make sure Lila gets the discipline she needs." There was a smile on her lips, one of those smiles that said more than it should. Back at the car, Julia lingered a moment, hesitant to drive off. She'd left Lila with them before, but never for a full day. At the doorway, Lila stood with a shadow of worry clouding her small face. "You'll come back, right, Mom?" she asked, her voice soft and unsure, caught in the breeze. "Of course, sweetheart. I promise," Julia said, her words firm as she started the engine. From the window of the conference room, Julia watched as gray clouds draped the Iowa sky like a heavy curtain. She checked her phone and exhaled deeply, mentally shifting into presentation mode. Just then, her phone buzzed. A message from her mother lit up the screen. Lila spilled her milk at breakfast, still acting like a baby. You should be stricter with her. Julia frowned and typed a quick reply. Accidents happen. Is everything okay? How is she? The response came swiftly. I made her clean it up and reminded her to wash her hands. She brought her math workbook, but honestly, she can't even do basic problems. Tessa's son just won a piano competition. Julia stared at her phone, her pulse picking up. Why did her mother always measure Lila against every other child? Why couldn't she just see her for who she was? She was still trying to find the right words when the conference room door opened. Dr. Patel stepped in with a calm, reassuring voice. Ready, Julia? The CEO's on his way. She gave a composed smile. I'm ready. But even as she opened her notes, her thoughts were still at that White House across town, with the little girl who had her eyes and her heart. And just like that, the slideshow began, but in the back of her mind, a different story was still playing. It had been a year ago, on the night of Margaret's grand Christmas party. The house was filled with distinguished guests, sipping champagne beneath glittering chandeliers and exchanging polished pleasantries. Lila, small and shy, had been made to stand at the grand piano to play a song she'd practiced for weeks. Her fingers trembled visibly, and as she began, nerves got the better of her. She stumbled through the notes, making several noticeable mistakes. I'm sorry. I can't, Lila whispered, barely audible over the quiet murmurs of the crowd. With a composed smile, Margaret turned to the guests and said with a gentle chuckle, my granddaughter must need more practice. Some children are born gifted, others, well, are a bit slower to catch up. That night, Julia had taken Lila home early, unable to bear another moment of it. Later, as she lay beside her daughter, holding her close in the dark, she whispered into Lila's hair, you are incredibly special, don't let Grandma's words tell you otherwise. But even as she comforted her child, the moment had carved something deep and painful into Julia's heart. Shall we begin? Dr. Patel's voice cut through Julia's thoughts, snapping her back into the present. She straightened her posture, adopted her professional calm, and began her presentation, clicking through slides with practiced confidence. The culmination of 5 years of work, research into a new treatment for neurodegenerative conditions, unfolded before her colleagues. Though thoughts of Lila tugged at her focus, Julia forced herself to stay present. Her sense of duty momentarily overpowered her personal concern. But partway through, her smartphone buzzed. Once. Then again. And again. Trying to ignore it, she kept presenting, but the persistent vibration gnawed at her composure. During a short break, she finally checked her messages. Her mother had sent a string of complaints. Lila ate cookies without asking. No discipline. Still struggling with math drills. Handwriting is a mess. Then came the sharpest blow. Nina thinks maybe it's time you consider special education. It might help her. She's not keeping up. Julia's chest tightened as she read that last line. This wasn't concern. This was pressure, a narrative they'd been trying to force on her for months. She remembered clearly, 3 months earlier, on a quiet Sunday, Nina had dropped by while Lila was drawing quietly in her room. Holding a steaming coffee mug, Nina had said casually, Julia, how long are you going to keep pretending you've got this all figured out? That child needs to be in a special class. It's obvious she's not normal. Julia had trembled with anger, though she kept her voice low to keep Lila from hearing. Lila is unique. She learns in her own way. Her teacher says the same. But Nina had only shrugged. You're just in denial. Mom agrees. Since then, Julia had kept her distance from Nina, carefully, purposefully. Now, standing alone in the break room, she gulped a glass of water and closed her eyes for a second. Focus, she told herself. She turned her phone to silent and returned to the conference with a steady face. The afternoon session went smoothly. The CEO praised her team's progress and spoke optimistically about the next phase of trials. Normally, that kind of recognition would have lifted Julia's spirits, but today, her thoughts were stuck elsewhere. As the final session wrapped up, her phone lit up again, a video call from David. It wasn't their usual time. Without a second thought, Julia slipped out of the room and answered. David? What's going on? His face appeared on screen, furrowed with concern. I got a strange alert from Lila. Isn't she at school? Julia's stomach dropped. No, she's with my mom and Nina today. What kind of alert? I don't know. It came from her watch, but I couldn't open it. I was working. I'll check now, Julia said quickly. Is she okay? I don't know, she admitted. I'm going to get her. She informed her boss of a family emergency and cut the meeting short. As she got into her car, a voice message from Lila came through. Julia tapped play with trembling fingers. Mom. Grandma said I have to practice cleaning because I'm too stupid, Lila's small voice cracked with fear. Please come back, Mom. Julia's foot slammed on the gas as her heart thudded in her chest. A storm of panic and fury surged inside her. She had never expected to hear something like that from her daughter. As the suburban streets rushed by in a blur, Julia questioned everything. Why had she tolerated the poison in her mother's words for so long? Why had she believed they wouldn't cross the line with Lila? When she finally pulled into the driveway of her childhood home, her phone buzzed again. A new message from David, a video was sent from Lila's watch. Check it now. Julia stared at the heavy oak front door, it seemed heavier than ever before. She stepped inside, met by an eerie silence. Everything was in its usual place, the gleaming marble floor, the symmetrical antique furniture, the family portraits gazing down from the walls. But instead of feeling familiar, the house felt cold, sterile, almost hostile. Hello, she called, her voice echoing through the house's grand stillness. In the formal living room, Nina sat on the sofa with one leg crossed over the other, lazily flipping through a fashion magazine, a half-filled wine glass balanced in her hand. She looked up with a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, too calm, too controlled. Oh, you're back early, she said smoothly, glancing at the clock. Didn't expect you yet. Julia's heartbeat kicked into high gear. Where's Lila? She's learning discipline, Nina said lightly, as though stating something mundane. You know, Julia, kids need that. You've always babied her. What are you even talking about? Julia's voice rose, sharp and raw. Where is she? Just then, a faint cry echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. The faint cry echoed again, it was coming from upstairs. Without giving Nina another glance, Julia bolted up the staircase, her heart pounding like a war drum. As she ran, her phone buzzed once more, this time it was a message from David. I watched the video. Get Lila out of there now. I've already contacted a lawyer. Julia's pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She raced down the hall, the sound of crying growing louder, leading her to the master bathroom. Just outside the door, she froze. Her mother's voice came through, cool and detached. Scrub harder, Lila. Look, it's still dirty over here. Julia flung the door open without hesitation, and what she saw inside stole the breath from her lungs. There, on the pristine white tiles, knelt her daughter. Lila was hunched over, scrubbing the toilet with trembling hands. A full-sized apron swallowed her tiny frame, the word made printed in bold, unforgiving letters across the back. Her face was streaked with tears, and her little hands were raw and red from the harsh cleaning. Standing beside her was Margaret, immaculate as ever in a silk blouse, casually holding a pair of rubber gloves she used to direct Lila's movements. For a brief moment, Margaret was caught off guard, but she quickly composed herself. Julia, you're home earlier than expected, she said, a note of urgency slipping into her otherwise smooth voice. I was just teaching Lila the value of household chores. Julia couldn't speak. Her body shook, her fists clenched at her sides, and her vision burned red. But she knew she couldn't unravel, not in front of Lila. Behind her, Nina appeared, chuckling softly. It's just a little punishment. For sneaking cookies without asking. We're teaching her discipline. Nina looked directly at Julia, her tone deliberately provocative. Honestly, this kind of experience is good for her, right, Mom? Margaret nodded, the corners of her mouth pulled into a cold, satisfied smile. She can't seem to manage academics, she said. Maybe being a maid suits her future better. Lila looked up at that moment, her eyes meeting Julia's. In those blue eyes were fear, confusion, and a silent plea for rescue. Julia remembered the first time she held Lila, 8 years ago, so small and soft in her arms. She had made a single vow that day, to protect this child with everything she had. Mom, Lila's voice was hoarse. I'm sorry, it was just one cookie. Those words broke something inside Julia. Without replying, she stepped forward and gently lifted her daughter into her arms. Lila's body trembled against her chest. As Julia adjusted her grip, she noticed the soft glow from Lila's smartwatch. It had been recording the entire time. Please, Julia, Margaret suddenly said, her tone turning syrupy. You're overreacting. This is just a lesson. You were raised this way too. Julia turned to face her, her eyes glacial. No, Mom. I wasn't raised like this. And I will never let Lila go through anything like it. Julia, calm down, Nina said, her earlier smugness now replaced with nervousness. We were just trying to help. You spoil her too much. Besides, she's not, she hesitated, choosing her words. She's not normal. What do you mean by that? Julia's voice was low and dangerous. Well, she struggles at school. The math, the delays, Nina's words trailed off as Julia shot her a look. Still holding Lila, Julia began untying the apron. It had been knotted tightly. The fact that someone had deliberately fastened this humiliating garment around her daughter made Julia's blood boil. But she kept her fury contained. What Lila needed now was safety, not an outburst. Mom, my backpack, Lila whispered. I'll get it, Julia said softly. We're leaving. Very soon. Without sparing another word for the two women, she walked down the hall, still carrying Lila. As they descended the stairs, Julia could feel the tension in Lila's small body slowly beginning to ease. From behind, Margaret called out, her voice sharp with disbelief. Julia. Do you understand what you're doing? You're blowing this out of proportion, we're family. Julia didn't stop. In the living room, Lila's backpack was right where they'd left it. She picked it up and moved toward the door. You're actually leaving? Nina asked, following them down the stairs. For the first time, there was a tremor of fear in her voice. It was just a bit of discipline. You're overreacting. Julia put her hand on the doorknob, but then her mother's voice cut through again, louder this time. Julia Bennett, stop right now. You are my daughter. And Lila is my granddaughter. I have rights. Julia turned slowly, for the first time letting her face fully reflect the swirl of sadness and fury inside. No, Mom. Blood doesn't define a family. Love and respect do. Without another word, she opened the door and stepped outside, her daughter held tightly in her arms. The early evening air wrapped around them, crisp and tinged with orange light. The sky, with its fading sun, seemed to signal a turning point, an end and a beginning. Once they were in the car, Julia gently settled Lila into the passenger seat. Her daughter was still shaking. Julia stroked her hair and clicked the seatbelt into place. It's okay now, Lila, she whispered. You're safe. As she started the engine, Lila looked up at her. Mom, it's all recorded, she said quietly, tapping her smartwatch. Dad told me to press the record button if something bad happened. Julia stared at her daughter's tear-streaked face, still glistening with sorrow, but behind the pain, something fierce and bright was shining. Choked with emotion, Julia cupped her cheek and said, You are so smart, Lila. So brave. Your dad's going to be so proud of you. She glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. On the porch, Margaret and Nina stood watching them go. Their faces were twisted with confusion, even panic, but Julia felt no regret. "Where are we going?" Lila asked quietly. "First, to a hotel," Julia replied, squeezing her hand. "And tomorrow, Dad's flying back. We're going to make a new plan. Together." Lila sat quietly in the passenger seat, her small hand gently resting on Julia's arm. That simple touch spoke volumes: trust, comfort, and a silent reassurance that reached deeper than words. As the car moved steadily through the fading twilight, Julia felt her resolve crystallize. She would never again allow her child to be put in harm's way, not for tradition, not for appearances, not even for blood. Lila's safety, her joy, her peace, that was Julia's unwavering duty as a mother. "Mom," Lila's voice broke the silence. "Am I really stupid?" Julia's chest tightened. The question sliced through her like ice. She gently pulled the car over to a quiet spot and turned to face her daughter. "Lila, absolutely not," she said firmly, her voice low and filled with warmth. "You are a special and wonderful child. Everyone learns at their own pace. Some people are good at math, others at art or kindness or imagination." She brushed a strand of hair from Lila's cheek. "Your drawings are beautiful, and your heart is even more so. Grandma and Auntie just don't understand how important that is." A faint smile returned to Lila's face, and for the first time in hours, a bit of light flickered behind her eyes. Later, in the hotel room, Julia stood by the window watching the early morning traffic trickle by. She had barely slept. All night she'd been tending to Lila, calming her after nightmares, holding her close, whispering words of safety. Her phone lit up with a message from David: "Landed. Be there in 30 minutes." Julia took a deep breath. She had told him everything the night before. Without hesitation, he had booked an emergency flight. "Mom," came Lila's groggy voice from the bed. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Is Dad coming?" "Yes, sweetheart. Very soon." Julia sat beside her, stroking her daughter's soft hair. "How are you feeling?" Lila paused, thinking. Then nodded. "Okay. But I don't want to go to Grandma's house ever again." Julia met her eyes. "You won't," she said with quiet conviction. "Never again." There was a knock on the door. Julia opened it, her heart tight. David stood there, jet-lagged and worn from 36 hours of travel, but his posture was alert and his expression filled with fierce protectiveness. "Dad!" Lila cried, launching herself into his arms. David knelt down and hugged her tightly. "I'm so sorry, Lila. I came as fast as I could." He gently took her arm and looked at the smartwatch. "This helped you, didn't it?" Lila nodded proudly. "I remembered what you said. I pressed record when something felt wrong." David glanced at Julia, and in his eyes she saw the storm of emotions: grief, rage, guilt. "I spoke to Clark," he said, referring to his lawyer. "After watching the video, he said we can act immediately." The three of them sat together, quietly planning their next steps. While Lila watched cartoons in the next room, David leaned in. "When I saw that video," his voice was low, thick with emotion. "I couldn't believe it." "That your own mother, I know," Julia said, her voice hollow. "I didn't want to believe it either. But the signs were there, the way she criticized Lila, all the comparisons, the discipline. I just didn't see how far it had gone." "They're not coming near her again," David said, jaw tight. "That's a promise." Julia nodded. "But in this town, they have influence. And my mother doesn't let go easily." David looked out the window. "I've been offered a transfer to the San Diego branch. I was going to turn it down, but now I'm thinking maybe it's time." Julia blinked. "California?" He nodded. "Sunshine. The ocean. A fresh start. For Lila. And for you." For a moment, Julia said nothing. The idea of leaving Iowa felt both sudden and liberating. What about my job? There are plenty of top pharmaceutical companies out west. I've heard great things about your work. If you want to stay in research, you'll find something. Or maybe it's time for something new. 2 days later, they sat in a quiet district courtroom. Thanks to Lila's smartwatch recording and Julia's sworn statement, the judge granted an emergency restraining order. Margaret and Nina didn't appear, only their legal representative. Ms. Bennett, the judge said, her voice calm but firm, this is a textbook case of psychological abuse. I'm forwarding this matter to Child Services. Walking out of the courthouse, Julia held Lila's hand tightly. The hearing had been exhausting, but there was a strange peace in knowing they were finally being heard. What happens now? Lila asked, her voice small but hopeful. A new adventure begins, Julia said with a smile. We're going to California. She gave her daughter's hand a little squeeze. There's a big ocean, and the sun shines all the time. Lila's eyes lit up. Will Dad live with us too? Julia and David exchanged a glance. That part, they hadn't figured out yet. We're your parents, David said gently. No matter how things look, we'll both be with you. A week later, Julia stood in her apartment, the rooms nearly bare. She had sold or donated most of her belongings, there was no room in their new life for old burdens. That evening, as Lila came back from school, David arrived holding 2 plane tickets. First flight's tomorrow morning, he said with a smile. You ready? That night, Julia sat at the kitchen table and wrote one final letter. Everything she hadn't said aloud, she poured into that single page. To Mother and Nina, you were related to us by blood, but that never made you family. Family loves, protects, and accepts. The wounds you inflicted on Lila will stay with her, but she is stronger than you imagined. She is kind, she is brave, and she will overcome. We are starting a new life. Please don't try to find us again. It would be useless. Goodbye. Julia sealed the envelope and placed it gently on the desk. It would be delivered by the real estate agent after they left. Before dawn, the 3 of them slipped quietly out of the apartment for the last time. Lila trailed behind with a small suitcase in tow, her sleepy eyes flicking up at her parents as they locked the door. Ready? Julia asked, her voice soft in the morning stillness. Yes, Lila said, holding up her smartwatch. I brought Dad's present. David smiled, his hand resting affectionately on her head. That'll always protect you, sweetheart. They climbed into the car and pulled out onto the silent streets, the world still dark before sunrise. As Julia watched the town roll past outside the window, a strange feeling bloomed in her chest, not sadness, not fear, but something warmer. Hope. Mom? Lila asked from the back seat. What kind of place will our new home be? Julia turned slightly, her smile calm and honest. I don't know yet. But one thing I do know, wherever we are, as long as we're together, that's home. That's what real family means. The car slipped quietly onto the highway, leaving behind the town, the pain, and the past. Ahead of them lay a blank page. The calendar read 2029. In Margaret Bennett's once lavish bedroom, time had dulled the shine of everything. She now lay confined to a hospital bed, her eyes hollow as they stared out the frost-dusted window. 5 years had stripped her of her strength and etched deep lines into her once flawless face. Mom, it's time for your medicine. Nina entered, her voice tired, her steps slower than they used to be. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. The sharpness that once defined her demeanor had long since faded into quiet resignation. Margaret gave a frail nod. Pancreatic cancer, terminal, had slowly drained her, day by day. Julia. Lila, she whispered, as she often did now, her eyes never leaving the gray landscape outside. Not yet, Nina replied softly. But we're still looking. For 3 years she'd hired private investigators. But Julia and Lila had vanished without a trace, as if they'd stepped into fog and never looked back. Did bad things, Margaret murmured. Want forgiveness, Nina said nothing, but in her silence was reflection. As her mother's health had declined, she'd begun to see it, how far they had gone. That day, 5 years ago, when they forced Lila to scrub the floor in shame, something fundamental had broken. Not just family ties, but a line in the soul: respect, dignity, love. That weekend, Nina walked into the local newspaper office, visibly unsure. She handed a note to the editor. "Could you publish this?" It was a short ad: "To Julia and Lila, I am deeply sorry for the pain we caused. Mom's time is almost gone. Please, come back." Nina. A week later, Margaret's condition worsened. The doctor told Nina they were down to days. She sat beside her mother's bed, holding her withered hand and whispering prayers neither of them had spoken in years. But the miracle never came. Margaret Bennett passed away quietly, never seeing her daughter or granddaughter again. The funeral was held on a crisp, cloudless morning. Mourners filled the church, and town dignitaries lined up to offer tributes. One eulogy after another painted the image of a formidable woman, one who had shaped the town's legacy. Only Nina knew what lay beneath the surface. She sat alone in the last pew, tears falling silently, grief, guilt, and the weight of truths that had never been spoken. As the mourners filed out toward the cemetery, a car sat parked under an old maple tree at the edge of the church grounds. "Are you sure this is okay?" Lila asked, now 13, her long hair brushing her shoulders, her features more refined, mature beyond her years. Julia nodded. "I came to say goodbye. Nothing more." They had flown in from California just for this. David waited in the car, giving them space. He and Julia had never remarried, but over the years they'd built a solid, respectful rhythm, co-parents, partners in love for their daughter. Together, the three of them watched the funeral from a distance. Lila gently squeezed her mother's hand. "Did you want to see Grandma?" she asked. Julia studied her daughter's face, so strong now, so compassionate. The old wounds had healed with time, replaced by wisdom beyond her age. "She was regretful," Lila added. "Wasn't she?" Julia gave a small smile. "Yes. But real family isn't about blood. It's about love. And respect. Our family," she looked at Lila, then at David, "is right here." Together, they turned and walked back to the car. No more unfinished chapters. No more waiting for closure. As Julia looked back one final time, she felt it: freedom. True freedom. She understood now that forgiveness wasn't always something to be granted. Sometimes, it was something you let go of, for your own peace. And that was the most valuable gift of all.